Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
President Trump addresses a joint session of Congress. We'll bring you the highlights and the Democratic response.
And where do things stand with Ukraine after a contentious meeting at the White House last week? We'll let you know.
Plus, the measles outbreak in Texas continues to spread, what Health and Human Services Secretary RFK Jr. is saying. Those stories and more are straight ahead on Watching Washington. Good evening and welcome to Watching Washington. I'm Connor Sutterly.
And I'm Lindy Spence. Tonight we begin with a major political moment on Capitol Hill.
Amid a backdrop of conflicts abroad and economic concerns back home, President Donald Trump delivered an address to Congress Tuesday night, pushing Republicans to help turn his agenda into law.
The GOP currently holds slim majorities in both chambers. Julia Benbrook breaks down the night's biggest moments.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
President Donald Trump delivering his first speech to a joint session of Congress since retaking the White House.
We have accomplished more in 43 days than most administrations accomplished in 4 years or 8 years, and we are just getting started.
While Democrats mostly waved signs in protest, a disruption came early in the night, with Speaker Mike Johnson ordering the removal of Democratic lawmaker Al Green from the House chamber.
Remove this gentleman from the chamber.
The speech comes the same day Trump enacted 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada and doubled his tariff on Chinese goods to 20%, sparking concerns of a trade war.
Tariffs are about making America rich again and making America great again. There'll be a little disturbance, but we're okay with that.
Trump has made a whirlwind of moves since his inauguration, including firing thousands of federal workers in an effort to reduce the size of the federal government.
We'll be ending the flagrant waste of taxpayer dollars. And to that end, I have created the brand new Department of Government Efficiency, which is headed by Elon Musk, who is in the gallery tonight.
Several of those fired federal workers attended the speech as guests of Democratic lawmakers. Their party's rebuttal delivered by Michigan Senator Alyssa Slotkin.
America wants change, but there's a responsible way to make change and a reckless way. And we can make that change without forgetting who we are as a country.
In Washington, I'm Julia Benbrook.
On Tuesday, Senator Alyssa Slotkin delivered the Democratic response to President Trump's congressional address. She gave a sharp rebuttal to his speech, accusing his administration of mismanaging national security, as well as taking a reckless approach to handling foreign affairs. Slotkin made sure to highlight Friday's argumentative face-to-face meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky at the White House, where she said, "That scene in the Oval Office wasn't just a bad episode of reality TV. It summed up Trump's whole approach to the world. He believes in cozying up to dictators like Vladimir Putin and kicking our friends like the Canadians in the teeth." She questioned the effectiveness of his administration's strategies, saying that the meeting was a departure from traditional diplomatic practices. Slotkin also had much to say about President Trump's plans and handling of the U.S. economy.
Look, the president talked a big game on the economy, but it's always important to read the fine print. So, do his plans actually help Americans get ahead? Not even close. President Trump is trying to deliver an unprecedented giveaway to his billionaire friends. He's on the hunt to find trillions of dollars to pass along to the wealthiest in America. And to do that, he's going to make you pay in every part of your life. Grocery and home prices are going up, not down, and he hasn't laid out a credible plan to deal with either of those. His tariffs on allies like Canada will raise prices on energy, lumber, and cars, and start a trade war that will hurt manufacturing and farmers. Your premiums and prescriptions will cost more because the math on his proposals doesn't work without going after your health care. Meanwhile, for those keeping score, the national debt is going up, not down. And if he's not careful, he could walk us right into a recession.
Slotkin spoke for just a fraction of the time Trump did. Democratic leader Chuck Schumer has called her a rising star in our party. Her response comes at a pivotal time when Democrats are trying to recalibrate after damaging losses in November, where the party lost both the White House and control of the Senate.
Texas Representative Al Green was escorted out of Congress after interrupting President Trump's speech. Green stood, raised his cane, and shouted in protest before being removed by security. The House later voted to censure him, but Green remains defiant, saying he spoke out for those in need. This incident adds to the growing tensions on Capitol Hill.
The president said he had a mandate, and I was making it clear to the president that he has no mandate to cut Medicaid. I have people who are very fearful. These are poor people, and they have only Medicaid in their lives when it comes to their health care. And I want him to know that his budget calls for deep cuts in Medicaid. He needs to save Medicaid, protect it. We need to raise the cap on Social Security. There's a possibility that it's going to be hurt, and we've got to protect Medicare. These are the safety net programs that people in my congressional district depend on. And this president seems to care less about them and more about the number of people that he can remove from the various programs that have been so helpful to so many people.
The meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and President Trump in the Oval Office went south on Friday. The goal was to finalize and sign a minerals deal that would give the U.S. revenue from Ukrainian minerals in exchange for U.S. military protection.
The meeting ended early when the two presidents got into a shouting match and Zelensky was asked to leave. The deal was left unsigned. CNN reporter Julia Benbrook has the story.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky arrived at the White House Friday for high-stakes talks with President Donald Trump about the war in Ukraine. After sitting down in the Oval Office, an astonishing exchange. The two world leaders shouting at one another.
Is in big trouble. Wait a minute. No. You've done a lot of talking. Your country is in big trouble.
I know.
You're not winning. You're not winning this.
Part of today's goal was to sign an agreement that would give the U.S. access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals in exchange for what Ukraine hoped would be concrete security guarantees.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards.
It's been 3 years now since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And just a few weeks ago, U.S. leaders held talks with Russian leaders about a peace agreement. But Ukraine was not included in those talks.
Well, if I didn't align myself with both of them, you'd never have a deal. You want me to say really terrible things about Putin and then say, "Hi, Vladimir, how are we doing on the deal?" That doesn't work that way.
Zelensky departed early with no deal and no press conference. Trump posting on social media that Zelensky had, quote, disrespected the United States and was not, quote, ready for peace. At the White House, I'm Julia Benbrook.
European leaders met in Paris to discuss Ukraine and global security challenges, with military aid and the crisis in Myanmar high on the agenda. European leaders gathered in Paris at the Élysée Palace to discuss the ongoing war in Ukraine and broader geopolitical challenges. French President Emmanuel Macron hosted the summit, welcoming leaders from Germany, Italy, and other European nations. The summit comes amid growing concerns about military aid to Ukraine and the possibility of diplomatic talks. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky joined the discussions, urging Europe to remain united in supporting Kyiv. Leaders also addressed the escalating situation in Myanmar, expressing concern over human rights violations and discussing potential sanctions. The summit marks a critical moment for Europe and unity and the future of Western support for Ukraine, as well as Europe's stance on global humanitarian issues.
Up next, a new measles update as cases continue to rise.
Plus, a major retailer faces backlash, why some shoppers are calling for a Target boycott. Stay with us. More Watching Washington next.
Spain. G'day, mates.
Buenos dias.
Bonjour.
Hello from South Korea.
I'm studying abroad in Valencia, Spain this semester. I'm studying abroad in Sydney, Australia.
I'm studying abroad in Madrid, Spain.
Studying at Seoul National University.
At Lycée Supérieur in Toulouse, France.
And I'm really getting to enjoy meeting all the new people and the culture.
How different it is from Purdue University.
It is an absolutely fantastic experience.
I'm living my best life.
I can't wait to see you guys all overseas soon. A bientôt.
Adios.
Nos vemos de España.
I'm Rachel. I'm 19 years old. I'm a sophomore in computer engineering here at Purdue, and I'm the president of DAO. So DAO stands for Dance All Out, and it's kind of like a community where all dancers of different skill levels and artists have a space to express themselves and be artists and perform. We perform at things like the AAA Night Market and the VA, the Variation Showcase, at the end of the semester. We even had our own showcase last year, and that was really exciting. DAO not only offers like weekly classes and performance opportunities, but kind of like a really strong community / family to do it with. When people talk about college, or when you see in like coming of age movies, it's all about like the main character finding like the place where they belong, whether it's in school or like extracurricular or like with their friends or another hobby. But like this could be the place where you find like your coming of age moment, and like it could be the place where you discover like a big part of your life.
On Tuesday, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said his country will file claims with the World Trade Organization over President Trump's tariffs.
The United States launched a trade war against Canada, their closest partner and ally, their closest friend. At the same time, they're talking about working positively with Russia, appeasing Vladimir Putin, a lying, murderous dictator. Make that make sense. Canadians are reasonable, and we are polite, but we will not back down from a fight. Not when our country and the well-being of everyone in it is at stake.
The announcement came the same day Trump's blanket 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada went into effect. Trudeau announced a 25% tariff on more than $20 billion of U.S. goods immediately. The tariff will be added to another $86.2 billion in 21 days. He also said if Trump's tariffs don't cease, there are discussions about pursuing non-tariff measures. Trudeau said, "There are no winners in a trade war, and this is not the relationship Canada wants to have with America." More notably, also stating, "Donald, this is a very dumb thing to do." But just yesterday, Trump announced he will postpone these tariffs for 1 month.
A measles outbreak in Texas has now grown to 159 cases, prompting an on-site response from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The CDC announced on social media that it has deployed a team to Texas through EPI aid programs, providing rapid response support to help local health officials combat the spread of the virus. This comes after previous efforts, including lab support and the distribution of measles, mumps, rubella vaccines. State health officials confirmed 22 hospitalizations, with most cases in Gaines County, home to a large unvaccinated Mennonite community. Last week, Texas reported the first U.S. measles death since 2015, an unvaccinated school-aged child. Now, New Mexico officials have confirmed a measles-related death. In response to the outbreak, Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has announced efforts to provide vitamin A, ambulance assistance, and other treatments. Speaking to Fox News, Kennedy stressed that the government's role is to assist, not dictate, acknowledging widespread mistrust of vaccines in highly unvaccinated communities like the Mennonites. While Kennedy recognized that the vaccine can protect individuals and communities, he stopped short of an explicit recommendation for measles vaccination in a recent opinion piece. With the CDC on the ground and cases rising, health officials urge preventative measures. We'll continue to follow this developing story.
Robert Crimo III, the man accused of opening fire on a 4th of July parade in Highland Park, pled guilty Monday, avoiding a lengthy trial and guaranteeing a life sentence. Crimo faced 69 counts of murder and attempted murder for killing 7 people and injuring nearly 50 others during the 2022 mass shooting. His unexpected guilty plea came just before opening statements, shocking the courtroom. His mother protested, but was told to remain quiet or leave. Authorities say Crimo, then 21 years old, spent weeks planning the attack. On July 4th, he climbed to a rooftop above the parade route and opened fire with a high-powered rifle, sending crowds fleeing in panic. Disguised in women's clothing, he ditched the weapon and escaped into the crowd. After, he fled to Wisconsin, where police say he considered another attack. He was then arrested. Survivors, including the family of 8-year-old Cooper Roberts, who was left paralyzed by the tragedy, expressed relief at his plea, finding a sense of justice and closure in the legal proceedings.
The U.S. Supreme Court has rejected the Trump administration's attempt to freeze nearly $2 billion in foreign aid, but the timing of the money's release remains unclear. Wednesday, the court ruled 5-4, denying an emergency appeal from the Trump administration to block the release of almost $2 billion in foreign aid funds. These funds, approved by Congress, were set aside for work that has already been done. Nonprofit groups say the delay has hurt life-saving programs around the world, leading to service cutbacks and layoffs. While the court's decision is a victory for these organizations, the funds have still not been released. The Trump administration has argued that it has replaced a blanket spending freeze with individual decisions, canceling a number of contracts and grants. Justice Samuel Alito and other conservative justices dissented, saying the court should not have overstepped in this case. The ruling does not say when the funds must be released, and because of that, the matter is expected to continue to play out in lower courts.
A Texas biotech company is making strides toward reviving the woolly mammoth, with recent experiments bringing science fiction closer to reality. Dallas-based Colossal Biosciences have successfully engineered mice with woolly mammoth traits, such as long, shaggy fur, using gene editing technology. This achievement marks a significant step toward their goal of producing a mammoth calf by 2028. The company believes reintroducing megafauna, such as the woolly mammoth, could help restore Arctic ecosystems and combat climate change. However, some scientists question the ecological implications of de-extinction efforts. Despite these concerns, Colossal remains committed to pushing the boundaries of genetic engineering in its pursuit of reviving extinct species.
Target is facing a 40-day consumer boycott, which began on Ash Wednesday, the first day of Lent. Reverend Jamal Bryant, a prominent Atlanta area megachurch pastor, launched the boycott. He argues that the retailer's shift away from diversity, equity, and inclusion policies betrays the Black and minority communities that have supported the company. The boycott follows Target's decision last month to scale back on its DEI programs, a move the company said was in response to conservative court rulings and pressure from right-wing groups. Target was once seen as a corporate leader in promoting diversity initiatives, but that reputation has taken a hit as the company faces criticism from both sides of the political spectrum. The timing of the boycott coincides with Target's broader financial challenges. The retailer is facing slower consumer spending, the impact of new tariffs on imported goods, and pressures from investors looking for stronger performance in 2025. Target has declined to comment directly on the boycott as the 40-day protest continues. The company will need to balance corporate decisions with community relations.
The Vatican shared its most recent update on the Pope's health this past week. The Vatican has reported no new medical crises for Pope Francis. He has not experienced episodes of respiratory failure or bronchospasm since Monday. His overall clinical condition still remains stable, including his heart, kidney, and blood values. He has not run a fever and is alert and cooperative with his therapies. His treatment continues as the Vatican prepares for Lent.
Our in-studio guest this week is Dr. Mario Crucini.
The full interview just ahead on Watching Washington.
I mean, every year is different, but it hasn't changed that much. Our league is just ominous, and you better lace them up tight and be ready to play every night. If not, you're going to get beat.
have a special guest with us in the studio this week. Mario Crucini is a professor of economics here at Purdue University who specializes in international trade.
Watching Washington, Sophie McLaughlin is standing by to talk with Professor Crucini about the impact of tariffs and the U.S.'s relationship with trade partners.
Thank you. That's right. Dr. Crucini is joining us today. Thank you for being here and making time in between your classes. My first question, can you explain how tariffs work?
Yes, thanks for the invitation, Sophie. I appreciate it. So tariffs in some ways are much like other taxes, right? We're putting a tax on a product, typically it'll be a product rather than a service because a lot of trade is actually goods traveling across the border. So the difference between tariffs and other taxes is it's a cross-border tax. So it's going to affect a foreign country in some set of products and therefore raise the price of those imports. So the tax base for tariffs is the import bundle that we bring into the United States, whereas other taxes like labor income taxes hit a much larger set of income flows and therefore have a larger base. But the major difference is cross-border transactions is the key part of it. And there's sort of three things we think about often, the 3 R's we call them sometimes. Revenue, reciprocity, and restriction, and we'll talk about those maybe as we go along. And I think Trump is using it also with a new letter and I think negotiation, so I guess we'll talk about that a little bit as well.
Yeah, so the stock market had a swift reaction when these tariffs went into place. Stocks started to fall. Can you tell us why they reacted this way?
Well, the stock market is often a swift grader, right, in terms of economic activity. It can sometimes overreact or underreact, but definitely if it's a large change and a persistent change or a cumulative change, then we have to take it seriously and pay close attention to it. I think there's a number of things to think about here. One is we have trading relationships. I'll talk about Canada and Mexico in particular because they're a little bit a newer part of the focus. China in the first round of tariffs was more the focus perhaps. So Canada and the United States and Mexico have a very integrated trading relationship. This goes back, I mean, I wrote my undergraduate thesis in the mid-'80s on an early auto pact agreement between the United States and Canada. It was restricted to autos because a lot of the trade at that time was automobiles across the Ontario and Michigan border between the two countries. And that's a part of history I've also explored myself. That supply chain has been in existence since the 1910s, 1920s.
Wow.
And obviously things have changed with foreign multinationals moving into both countries, so it's a much more diverse marketplace. But that link is an important one. And then later in history, of course, as you know, Mexico is developing a manufacturing base, and then an agreement was signed where Mexico joined later on to become, it's now the USMCA, used to be the NAFTA or North American Trade Agreement. So in this part of America, from Mexico through to Canada is quite an integrated trade area. It's not quite as integrated as Europe in modern times, the European Union, but it is quite integrated. So that's an important frame of reference. I think that interruption of those trade relationships is generally viewed as negative because there's an existing relationship and we're tariffing things. That's going to reduce imports, but also production on both sides of the border. And autos is an importantly impacted sector as well.
So how are these tariffs going to affect U.S. businesses and consumers?
Yeah, so I think for consumers, like people who look at tariffs, usually it's through the lens of the newspaper. You probably would encounter something close to this if you cross an international border, then they ask you to fill out a declaration form. If you don't have enough goods to bring in, you're not going to pay a tariff. So in some sense, consumers are only aware of tariffs when they kind of impact consumption, and it's very indirect. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Final goods can be tariffed. So avocados is just a good example.
Yeah.
Avocados from Mexico. There's not a lot of domestic production of them. It's just one small example, but it's one that's apparent because the consumer meets the avocado at the grocery store.
Yes.
And if the tariff passed through to the grocery store, then you're going to feel the full effect of the tariff on that product. The more complicated part is that most of trade is not final goods, and I think that's a bit of point of confusion. Most of trade is firm to firm. So effectively, in the auto industry, this is sort of obvious because it's a very complex product. There are a lot of parts that are sourced from many different countries. In North America, it's fairly integrated amongst the 3 countries, but there's still imports from other countries that also provide key inputs into automobiles. The chips and the chip shortage from COVID is a good example of that. So tariffs are going to hit this very complex supply chain. That makes it a little harder to understand, but it's just as important and even more important to understand it because the linkages are very, very tight between U.S., Canada, Mexico in terms of all the parts that go into a car. And in a sense, if we thought about something simpler like IKEA furniture, I don't know if people still buy IKEA furniture, you can assemble an IKEA desk in your home if you order in a box. So in some sense, a tariff on the IKEA table, you'd recognize it pretty immediately, you assemble it. But not many of us have ignition wires and transmissions sitting in our garages. We're not familiar with the complexity of that, therefore we're kind of at the mercy, if you will, of the auto industry to produce that final good. That means they have to integrate their supply chain and then get the least cost parts to produce that product for U.S. consumers. So when we go to the grocery store, we're shopping to save money, and tariffs are going to affect the allocation of our dollars. Firms face the same problem, but in a more complex environment in a sense, since they have to source all of the parts and then, of course, hire labor and capital to produce the goods. So it's a more complex environment, but the tariff has similar effects. It's just along those firm-to-firm transactions rather than consumer-to-store transactions. But we want to talk about both of those as well, I think. But,
yeah. So you kind of touched base on this with the consumer-to-consumer transactions, but how more specifically would this affect college students, like Purdue students right now, these tariffs?
Well, if we were looking at the auto industry, we'd look at all the parts that are used to produce an automobile and the cost of those parts and where they're coming from and whether they would be tariffed or not. So if you're a student or a consumer, just a consumer in general, you look at your consumption basket and you ask yourself, what parts of it would have an immediate effect due to the tariff? So if I think about, if you're breaking consumption into the major parts, we usually think about, for a student, it would be tuition, housing, food, beverages. I won't get into the details. Entertainment and transportation, right? So a large part of that is not going to be directly affected. The tuition, for example, or even the housing. But the food, the beverages, clothing, and transportation. Transportation is mostly, you're walking, you're skating, you're cycling, so even that it's going to be light. The other effects are a bit more roundabout. So transportation, if you were to buy a car, you'd probably buy a used car maybe, and then it wouldn't be so impactful. If you're buying a new car, then of course there could be an effect when those tariffs go into place. So the way to think about it is to think about your consumption basket, the shares of your expenditure on each part of the basket, and where are the tariffs going to hit most directly. Okay? So if you're a big fan of avocados, whatever, you can see that pretty quickly. If we're talking cars, electronic goods, you've got to kind of work through or have somebody provide an assessment of this entire supply chain, and that's much more complex. And then we have to think about how firms adjust in response to tariffs. That can mitigate the effects of the tariffs. But that's difficult to do quickly. Consumption patterns can change fairly quickly if you have alternatives. You can substitute towards lower U.S. cost alternatives or other foreign alternatives that come into the United States duty-free. So that allows you some latitude. So those, the economics of supply and demand, there are elasticities on demand side. How are you willing to change your consumption patterns in response to this? And on the firm side through these supply chain networks, and what capacity they have to adjust those supply chains in the short run. And it's a little more difficult in the short run than in the longer run, and I think that's why there's such a kind of a full stop and a big stock market reaction.
So what are the long-term consequences of this? Are we in a trade war? Could this lead to a recession?
Well, so 2 parts. First, the recession part, when we think about a recession, we're thinking about the entire macroeconomy. oddly, I know more about an early part of history than I know about today. So I've studied the tariff war in the 1930s. So at that point, average tariffs in the United States were about 40%, and they went up to 60, 65%. So it was an extraordinary elevation from high levels. And we attribute the tariffs in the U.S. and retaliation to producing, with our models, a mild recession, but a recession nonetheless. Right now, today, part of the issue is the tariffs haven't really gone on yet in terms of this round. So there's a lot of uncertainty as to where will they go on, when will they go on, what sectors will be affected. So I think the stock market right now is reacting more to the uncertainty about the tariffs than the tariffs themselves. Now there's a pause.
Yes.
And then there's going to be an April 2nd decision. What will happen there? There's uncertainty about that, that yet. So in terms of the permanence, historically those tariffs stayed high for quite some time. World War II came on the back end, and of course that disrupted any attention to tariff policy. And then there was a realization that those were fairly damaging to the international economy. And there was a period of generational trade liberalization from the 1950s through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So that took quite some time for tariffs to come down. Now we've got a lot of experience with free trade, and we're closer to free trade now than we were then. So stepping back to that is easier now than it was then. So I think they would be shorter lived potentially. Now, many of us thought the Trump tariffs from 2017-18 would have come off with the Biden administration, but they didn't. So that creates a little bit more permanence, and there's a little bit of, the calculus of that is a little trickier. But I have to say they'd be more transitory than those earlier historical tariffs.
So do you think these ones are, you mentioned permanence, do you think these ones are more likely to be reversed or to come in a month? Like, what does this delay mean? What is, not to say Trump's agenda, but what is he wanting to do in this month? And could those be reversed? What would that mean then?
I mean, we're seeing the pauses and the reversals. So I think there's some consideration of the impacts in real time here, and then there's pauses and reactions to that. He's stating the use of this as a negotiation with things like fentanyl and immigration. So they're not directly related to those things particularly, but they are, they are a negotiating tactic. So that seems to be part of why the dynamic is kind of very sudden and abrupt and changing. But also there are a lot of voices in the conversation in terms of if we put tariffs on automobiles in the supply chain, it would have a negative effect on U.S. producers, Canadian producers, and Mexican producers. So that's coming through in the conversation. And there's often carve-outs for inputs, right? A business can ask for a tariff reduction if the inputs are crucial to its production. But again, that will take some time, but that's part of the conversation as well. So there's quite a bit of back and forth going on in the background. I'm not privy to the conversations, but that's kind of the inference that I make from the forward step and the back step.
Now, would you be able to explain to us why? So Trump has delayed additional tariffs on Canada and Mexico, but Canada has still kept in place their initial retaliatory tariff. Now, why would that be? Is that just like to prevent Trump from putting on the tariffs in a month? Is that like also a negotiation, like a scare tactic? Like, I don't quite understand that. So could you help explain that for us?
Well, I mean, it doesn't have to be that the U.S. is the first mover either, right? So in some sense, even though in the history the Smoot-Hawley bill gets a lot of attention because it was a massive piece of legislation in 1930 on the eve of the Great Depression, but there were some other tariff increases by other countries in the 20s as well as in the United States that don't get so much attention. So it's not always that, it's not one, there's often one country would initiate and then others would respond, but it wouldn't have to be the United States making the first move, especially if there's a discussion of tariffs and there's a prior history of tariff increases earlier in time. So I think that's not entirely unexpected. But the other thing is, things are coming off the shelves too in terms of Canadians taking U.S. products off the shelf. That's a little bit unusual, I think, as well.
That's all the time we have today. Thank you to our guest, Dr. Crucini, for joining us today. And thank you for watching. See you next time on Watching Washington.